Holy crap, was 2024 a good year for horror fans. I have to say, even though there's plenty of people out there saying that they don't make horror films like they used to, I feel like we've been eating good the past couple of years, with 24 being top notch. So I thought it would be a good idea to rank up a bunch of the more notable and acclaimed films from the year. There were so many strong releases that I had to winnow it down to only 12 movies, and I had my patrons pick which ones were on here. So just be aware that if you're going to say you forgot this movie down in the comments, we didn't forget it, it just didn't get picked. Most notable though was Nosferatu, which probably would have been on here, but since it wasn't widely available for people to see easily in time for the deadline, it didn't get on here. And I want to point out that since these movies are pretty recent, there won't be any spoilers discussed here, so don't be afraid to get them ruined. So that roster went out to all of my patrons, and we had some great participation as this bunch answered the call. And I got 47 rankings in total, including mine, which means that the best score that a movie can get is 47, which would be as everyone put the same movie as number one for 1 point each. And the worst score that it could get is 564 if everyone put the same film in dead last, here worth 12 points. So let's get right to it and look at 2024 and the horrors that it held. In the film world, the video would be too long to talk about the real world stuff.
Come on in.
Great.
Do you like pie?
Coming in at dead last, we have a movie that was in this spot for most of the time slot, although there was one movie that started to catch up to it. And it would have only taken probably one more list to get it out of there. With 391 points, we have In a Violent Nature. It got put in dead last 8 times, 17% of the rankings. And here's a neat spoiler. Every single movie on this list today got at least one dead last vote. This one was also put in first place 3 times, 6% of the votes. And I had this one fairly low myself since I put it in 10th place, but I still kind of liked this one. But I think I liked more of what it represented than what it achieved. I think the thing that didn't land here is the fact that they couldn't stick to their own premise. The idea of what a slasher villain is doing for the rest of the duration of the movie is great, like a horror Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead. And it was partly already covered in Behind the Mask, but this takes a different approach to it. And if they had ran with it and committed, it might have been fantastic. But then they chicken out. Like for a portion of the time, we're getting this look into what our killer is up to and walking around, but then it keeps cutting away from that, and we get bits like the campfire scene, and that's just like a standard slasher scene, and it's not what this is meant to be. There's one moment, the part where the killer finds the little toy car and is playing with it while the camper characters are in the background and discuss some exposition stuff, and that's what I wanted from this movie. That moment gives us some character elements of the villain, and we see this cool dichotomy of this playful innocence right before something terrible is going to go down, and it humanizes him for a moment. But then we're just not getting enough of that. Like, there's some pretty wild and over-the-top kills, but again, I feel like they're sort of going against what this is, setting itself up to be. And for all the talk of the yoga death, the most unsettling for me is the drowning death, mainly because we're kept at a distance from it, and it just happens so matter-of-factly. Our number 11 film came close to being dead last, and in the end, there was only 4 points that kept it out of there. And with 387, we have Maxine, the finale of the X trilogy. This one had 9 dead last votes, 19% of the time, the highest number here, and this is the only film that didn't get a single first place vote. Every film on this roster had at least one person put it in first place, except this one, which only made it to 3rd place, and it was put there twice. And I had this in dead last, and this might be the only film on this roster that I just kind of hated. Hated might be a strong word, but I just didn't get anything out of it at all. And the main reason that it doesn't click with me is Maxine herself. She worked in X because the whole point in that film was to make you think that Lorraine is the final girl character, but then it pulls that rug out near the ending and you realize that Maxine is the lead, even though she's an unconventional heroine. But then you put that character to the forefront and she's just not interesting or likable enough to string a whole movie around. But then the story itself just doesn't work since it's this random sort of pastiche of a bunch of things that just don't add up. Especially when you factor in the ideas that Maxine herself doesn't even really do anything. If her character is removed from the film, things still shake out the same way. Like, she's like a side character in her own movie, but a side character who doesn't impact the plot. There's a moment in the end where she makes a statement about being willing to do anything, which is ironic because she didn't really do anything. The only reason she comes out on top in the ending is because everything had already happened. She just walks up to a vanquished villain and is like, I did this. And I guess that could have been an interesting concept if they explored that, but it seems like they weren't even aware of that enough to develop it.
Maybe she should save herself. I did.
Let's go down to our number 10 movie now, and this was a little bigger drop down in points, but not too big, since we went down to 374 with Smile 2. This one was put into dead last 6 times, so that's 13% of the time, and it did get one first place nod. And I had this one pretty low since I had it in 11th, and I know that's low, but honestly, this movie's fine. I know that the first Smile had a fair amount of fans, but I really wasn't one of them. It just felt like a really standard horror film that followed a number of cliches, and it's one of the films that I consider horror light, which isn't a slam, but there's this class of horror flicks that I feel like are starter horror films that appeal to a broader audience and bring in non-horror fans to the genre, and that's a good thing. The genre needs more fans, and stuff like Smile brings them in. But if you've been watching horror for a while, you recognize that this stuff has been done before and done better. And this movie is better than the first Smile, but it also is the first Smile. This movie follows the first one beat for beat, and even though I think it does it better, you still know every single thing that's coming. About 15 minutes into this one, I said, oh, I bet you that this is how this movie will end, and that's exactly how it ended. Exactly. But I also think that this one suffers from the same thing that Maxine does. It makes the main character of the film, the person we're supposed to be rooting for, a spoiled, self-centered brat. And Naomi Scott is really great in the role, but part of the movie is that when she starts acting insane because of these visions the creature is giving her, people think she's just being nuts and high maintenance because that's what she's been like before, and that makes it hard to empathize with her. But on the whole, this is fine, and I'd say it's about 15% better than the first one, but I also didn't like that one all that much, so it's not a ringing endorsement. We're into the single-digit movies now as we move on to our number 9 movie, and this again didn't drop down dramatically since it's coming in with 359 points, and now we have The First Omen. This did get 5 dead last votes, 11% of the time, and was also put into first place 1 time. And I had this in 8th place, so on the lower end of things, but I actually quite liked it. But here's the thing. I think that a lot of people really clicked with this one when it came out for one main reason. It's an Omen film. And let's face it, the Omen films generally aren't great. So when they announced this, it didn't sound like a winner at all. Most of these were doing another entry, and it's a prequel, but it also might be the start of a new franchise. You figure it out. Those movies just aren't that good. So people went to see this one with very low expectations, but were pleasantly surprised when it was pretty good. But that's all that I'll give it. Pretty good. I liked it, and I liked watching it, but I'll also say that it didn't really stick with me or make me think much about it afterwards. It came out at the same time as Immaculate, and both films mined the same territory and felt very similar in a lot of ways. And I think I feel the same way about them both, even if I enjoyed this one just a skosh more. But also, when I saw this, it was well after release, so that initial surprise of it actually being a good movie had faded, and my expectations were a little higher. But it was an Omen movie, so let's face it, they weren't that high. And I was pleased enough. Like, sure, I thought the twist was predictable, and you can kind of see where things are going, but it's not so insanely carbon copy that it feels pointless to watch it. I'll admit, though, the weird ending bit that ties it into the original film felt like some sort of weird Marvel post-credit scene and didn't feel like it fit with the rest of it.
It's all for you.
Our drop downs are getting bigger now as we head on to our number 8 film, and this one goes down a full 36 points. And this is the first one that people were particularly split on, since it's Cuckoo. It was put into dead last 2 times, and was also put into first place 3 times for 6% of the rankings. And I have this one quite a bit higher than it landed, since this was my second place pick, and I enjoyed the hell out of this. The whole beginning of this one is just such a ride. It's just throwing all of these different things at you, and it's all so disorienting. For a solid half hour or so, it feels like a random assortment of scenes that this character is going through and seems so unconnected. And you're thinking, how is all of this going to come together? And you start to worry that maybe it won't. But then it does, and it does it really well. Like, I get it if you have this one lower, because it is a weirdly subjective experience of confusion. But it really landed for me. And I thought it was going to be an unsatisfactory finale, but it wasn't. The various plot threads all make sense, and here's the thing. I feel like this one could be less interesting as it begins to explain the mysteries that it's raising, and I'm sure that's how some people feel about it, and it's possible that some people didn't even enjoy the mystery aspect of it anyway, but then it's running that same risk with the reveals, but it all did it for me. I saw someone online compare this to Phantasm in a way, in that it's like this random dreamlike collection of stuff that just doesn't seem to fit, and all feel like they're from different movies, and yet still link up somehow. And I get that. This doesn't feel like Phantasm much, but they do have that in common. Here comes one that I was really curious to see the ranking of, because it seemed like some people I talked to loved it and others really did not. So it's appropriate that it's right in the middle, because with 298 points we have Alien Romulus. This did get 4 dead last votes, 9% of them, and it was also put into first place 3 times, 6%. And I was on the lower end with this one because I put it in my 9th place spot. And I wouldn't say that I didn't like it, but I also didn't much like it. First up, the good. I like that it felt more like an Alien film that we've been getting for a while. This is the type of thing I want from the franchise, as opposed to the whole engineer and black goo stuff. But I also like that this doesn't just completely disregard those. I also think that the zero-gravity acid blood sequence was really well done and very inventive. However, there's a number of things that I just couldn't get behind. Once again, it's a group of characters that I don't much care about. There's also a god-awful CGI or AI character that's so insanely distracting. And then the ending gives me this weird hybrid, just like Part 4 did. And can a movie called Alien give me the characters having to face off against, you know, the alien? The funny thing is that most of the criticism that I've seen of this one revolves around the forced callbacks, because they had the shoehorned lines of dialogue from the earlier films in there. But honestly, compared to the stuff I talked about above, I didn't much care about those. It was like 3 lines of dialogue. Were they distracting? Sure, but not nearly as much as Puppet Ian Holm. I guess that they've tweaked it for the Blu-ray release and tried to make it look better. So I went to take a look and I confirmed that yes, it's about 4% better. And those lines of dialogue take up about 8 seconds of screen time total. And the final act with the dumb CGI hybrid thing is like 20 minutes. So yeah, bigger fish to fry. But on the plus side, I feel like this is a step in the right direction, and I do hope that they continue the franchise in this way, even if I'm not overwhelmed with this one.
Get away from her. You bitch.
We're going into the upper part of the list now, and the next one, our number 6 movie, only dropped about 11 points. And now, let's go to Strange Darling. This was put into dead last 3 times, so 6%, and was equally put into first place 3 times, another 6%. And I have this one a little higher where it landed because I put this one in 4th place. And it's one that earns its higher place for me based mostly on vibes. This has a certain similarity to Cuckoo for me, like not in the way it feels, because that movie has that surrealistic element to it, and this one doesn't, as it's more like a fractured narrative. But much like that one, I love that it just throws me into this story, and I didn't know what was really going on, and was just along for the ride as the pieces fell into place. It almost lost me for a second when it showed me what I'm calling the most depraved breakfast that I've ever seen in a film. Look at this. They're making a couple of eggs. And using an entire stick of butter. And then threw what looks like a whole nother half stick of butter on top of it. And then like a whole canister of whipped cream. I swear that I went into cardiac arrest just watching that part. But what I really liked here was the playing with expectations. I like that this movie tries to convince you that things are happening one way, but then takes things in another way, but then figures that you'll realize that it'll go another way, and is constantly teasing you with the idea it might go in another direction. Just when you're convinced you have it figured out, they give you some clues and hints, and you're like, oh wait, maybe not. But then it is that way, and even if you've got it down, they keep you guessing. But then the funniest thing about this one is the giant shot on 35mm film that they plaster over the beginning of the credits. And it's like, yeah, what do you want, movie? Little pat on the back? A reach around? Congratulations, I guess. Let's head on now to our number 5 movie, and this is another one that I was really curious to see where it landed because it might have been one of the most discussed films of the year, and with 286 points, only 1 point lower than Strange Darling, we have Longlegs. This one did get 2 dead last votes, but was also put into first place 4 times, the largest amount of firsts that we've had so far. And I had this one in 3rd place, and I'll admit that I'm a bit of a sucker for Oz Perkins. This might be my least favorite of his films so far, I think, but I still think it was very, very good. Granted, I'll say this, I think that the setup for it all works far better than the payoff, but I still enjoyed it all, just maybe the first part more than the final act. There's just this amazing atmosphere going on all throughout that's unmatched by practically anything else for the year. The sheer dread that's coursing through this whole thing is awesome, and there's several scenes that had me gripped. I will say that I feel like the thing that really holds this one back is Nick Cage. He's doing his normal Nick Cage thing and being weird and over the top, and it so much does not fit in with the rest of this movie. Like, he seemed like he wandered in from some other film, and it's just like, hey, can I get in on this? Now, even though I don't think the ending lives up to the promise of the beginning, I do still think it's pretty cool, and it works well enough. But I just think this one could have been better with some sort of different finale. That being said, though, I think this one was hurt by the sheer amount of hype that it received. Anytime any movie is called the most terrifying and scary film in ages, there's a certain amount of expectations that you're going to have. And I was lucky enough to avoid a good amount of that. And besides, I had my own expectations considering it was a Perkins film, but I wasn't really expecting scares. I was looking for unease, and I certainly got that.
Oh, but it seems I wore my long legs today. What happens if I...
Our number 4 movie wasn't as close as that, but it still wasn't that big of a drop down since it's 4th place. With 278 points, we're moving on to Oddity. What's crazy is that this one was put into dead last 3 times, which is more than Longlegs or even Cuckoo, which is in 8th place, but it was put into 1st place 2 times, less than either Longlegs and Cuckoo, but it just had consistently higher scores all around. And I had this one in 5th place, a touch lower when it landed, but pretty close. And this one was one of the 3 films on this list that I watched completely blind. I generally don't watch trailers, so that stuff doesn't get spoiled. But with Cuckoo, Strange Darling, and Oddity, I went in with knowing the title and nothing else whatsoever. Like with Oddity, I knew that it involved that weird puppet thing because I saw a picture of it in the box art, but that's it. And I ranked all 3 of those movies higher, so maybe that's saying something about me and how I watch stuff. And I guess I prefer films that I don't know anything about before seeing them, but I really liked this one. And this is one that if you didn't enjoy, I think I get it. Like the whole movie's all vibes. I really liked the whole tone of the thing and the mystery of it all. And sure, I knew the general mystery that was the underlying plot point, but it was the mystery of how it unfolded that was the interesting thing to watch. And what I loved about this movie is that, like, unlike several that I talked about on here, like The First Omen or Smile 2, I had absolutely no idea where it was going. Not to sound jaded, but I've seen enough movies by this point that I can kind of figure out where most plots are headed towards. But there's also plenty of times that films switch things up and I just have no clue where it's all going. And this was one of them. Top 3 time, and the points are still vaguely tight, but it still wasn't super close, and our number 3 movie is landing with 261 points, 17 points down from Oddity. And we have one of the more commercial entries here, and it's Abigail. This was also put into dead last twice, but it was put into 1st place 6 times, 13% of the rankings, and definitely the most number 1s so far. And I had this one lower than you guys since this was my 7th place pick. And again, I think it's a good indicator of how strong this year was that this was my number 7 film, and I thought it was a blast. This is a really fun movie with some great characters, sharp dialogue, and pleasantly surprising amount of gore. I think it's kind of weird that this is a Universal picture, and it started out life as a sort of remake of Dracula's Daughter, and it spun out of the fallout of the Dark Universe. I guess at one point they considered having it be connected to the Tom Cruise Mummy, but then after that, they meant for it to be part of that loose series of adaptations like The Invisible Man. But then, for whatever reason, they just made it its own thing and changed the title to Abigail. But here's the thing. I had a big problem with this one, and I'll avoid discussing it too much to not spoil a twist in the film. But there's a shift in focus in the final act here. The whole movie, up until that point, is focused on a specific antagonist and main villain. But then, in like the final 15 minutes or so, that all changes, and we're instead meant to root against someone else and I guess root for that previous villain. And honestly, none of that worked for me. I was enjoying what it was, and that shift felt forced to me and I lost some of my interest. Outside of that though, I had a blast with this one, and it feels like Radio Silence just keeps on making films that I consistently enjoy without ever being in love with.
How many bodies are we talking? Like 2, 3?
Only 2 films left, and this was surprising to me. There was a film that I expected to win, and it took an early lead. But then this one came in super hot and took the lead where it sat for most of the ranking window. But then, on the last day, the last handful of lists really tipped the scales, and this one ended up in 2nd place with 223 points, and it's Heretic. This one was put into dead last 1 time, and I know that I mentioned that every film on this list has at least 1 dead last vote, but this is the only film that only got 1 dead last. Every other film had more than 1, but this had only 1. But it was also put into 1st place 8 times, 17% of the rankings. And I had this one lower than it landed because this was my 6th place spot. But once again, to stress, I really dug this. This movie's great. And what's cool here is that this entire film hinges on what comes down to like 3 people. And it just so happens that all of these people are acting their hearts out. Although I have to say this, when it came out, I saw a number of articles and comments about Hugh Grant, and they were all like, oh man, Hugh Grant is so good at being a villain. Who knew? Who could have guessed that Hugh Grant, star of so many romantic comedies, could play such an evil guy? And I'll tell you who. Anyone who freaking saw Paddington 2, that's who. Granted, his character in this one isn't quite as devious and vicious as Phoenix Buchanan, but he's still pretty nasty, and of course, Hugh nails it. I have to say, I wasn't too hyped up on this one pre-release. I mean, it's from the guys who made Haunt in '65, and they wrote that god-awful Boogeyman film from '23. So when I saw that, I kind of wrote this off. But then everyone that I know that saw it had nothing but good things to say, so I got a little excited to check it out. And it mostly lived up to that hype. It's bringing up all of these lofty themes in the first half, and it gets into some complex issues with religion and belief. And I'll admit, I personally don't think that it manages to land with some of those issues, and it feels like they could have dug deeper, like making their overall message of the film feel a little lightweight, but it's still a great story. And even though I didn't have this one as high as it made it, I'm pretty happy that it landed there.
Have you ever played the Parker Brothers game, Monopoly?
And that leaves us with one movie, our top film of 2024, at least out of the ones that we included in this roster. And like I said, this one took an early lead, but then lost it, and only managed to push its way back into the top spot in the final couple of lists. And with 198 points, the only film to get less than 200 points, we have The Substance. This did make it into 2 dead last spots, but it was in first place 13 times, 28% of the lists. By far our most number ones. But those that had it low had it real low, creating this split. And I was one of the 13 to have this one in the top spot. This was my number one, and I think this is a slam dunk. I wasn't sure what to think about this one in the beginning. This was one that I actually did see a trailer for, and I thought it looked pretty cool, but could possibly also miss the mark and be a whole lot cringy. But then it wasn't, and it was bold and daring and feels like a mainstream film, but oh, is it not. My only complaint with this one was the length, but I'm also not mad about it. Like, I just feel like it could have had some trimming out of the middle section of the film, and it seemed to be repeating itself a bit. And I was like, I get it, let's move on. But the stuff it was showing me was still interesting, so it's not that big of a black mark on it. I guess the other thing that I thought was weird, but isn't a problem with the movie, is that once you know that Margaret Qualley is enhanced by prosthetic breasts, it's all you can notice. Another thing you can't help notice is the sheer amount of butt in this movie. I was going to make a supercut called The Substass that just featured all of the full-screen booty shots in this movie because they're so plentiful. There's women's butts, men's butts, monster butts, a whole cornucopia of cheek on display. But seriously, there's a lot happening here, and the film has a definite message to it that feels on the nose, but also doesn't feel like it's hitting you over the head with itself. It's telling you what it's about, but it's also giving you things to think about, so it never feels like it's just preaching. Also, on that same note, I really like that this movie actually tells you its rules and explains the situation, but then leaves you with so many questions. There's a lot going on behind the scenes and between the lines here, and it's maybe something I'll have to visit with an unanswered questions episode at some point. And yeah, it's number one, which is appropriate considering it's the only film in this roster to get nominated for an Oscar. In fact, it's one of only 7 horror films that were nominated for Best Picture ever. So it's clearly got something good going on, and I'm happy that it clawed its way up to the top, and let's hope that it doesn't explode into a bunch of body parts now that it's up there.
Head between your legs!
So there you have it. There's 12 solid horror films that were released in the year 2024. And as I mentioned, there's more out there too. That's how strong last year was for our genre. But not everything was good. There was some garbage too. So what I did was I asked my patrons to also include the 3 worst horror flicks that they saw last year, and I got a whole variety of selections. But in the end, there were 5 movies that got more votes than any others, and I figured we'd go over them here. At number 5, with 6 people calling it one of the worst, is the Blumhouse flick, Imaginary. It had a bigger budget than most, and they marketed the hell out of it, but it was just really bland and completely unmemorable. Our number 4 stinker had 1 more vote than that, and 7 people called it one of their worst, and was another one that got a lot of studio hype with Tarot. This isn't Blumhouse, but it sure felt like it. It had their general overall style to it, and even with an assortment of cool monster designs, it still couldn't make itself interesting. Coming in at number 3, we have the biggest budgeted one of this group, and the one that had the most pedigree behind it, because it's Watchers with 8 votes. It was by M. Night Shyamalan's daughter, and it was a rough year for his kids, because one directed this slog of a film, while another starred in his film Trap, which also almost made the top 5 worst list. The second worst film of the year bucks the trend of being bigger budgeted, half-hearted horror flicks from major studios by having 10 votes, and it's The Mousetrap. This is the first film to get released in this upcoming tidal wave of films taking advantage of Steamboat Willie being public domain, and it's just a mess. Like, I want to give it the benefit of the doubt compared to these other films, since it was made at less than 1/10 of the budget of any of them, but it goes above and beyond with being bad, and it was one of my personal 3 picks. And our number 1, the worst horror film of 2024, with a whopping 12 votes, is yet another Blumhouse entry with Night Swim. I don't even know what to say about this movie, except that it's just so insanely dull and forgetful that I had to look up the plot synopsis to be reminded just what happened in it. And yeah, it's about an evil swimming pool. Just terrifying, right? So good job, Night Swim. You win the distinction of being the true clunker of a film in a year full of actual good stuff. Alright, let me know what you thought of all this. What was your top pick for 24 in terms of good movies, but also the worst one you saw? My other two picks for worst were the new Crow flick, arguably horror related, and The Strangers Chapter 1, the most useless film that I've seen in recent history. I also want to mention that I really wanted to include I Saw the TV Glow, a film that I know has people split, but it would have been my number 1 best film. Easily. But I didn't put it on there because regardless of how they marketed it, I don't think it's a horror film at all. So yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and like this video if you enjoyed it. Also, subscribe to the channel if you like what you're seeing, and hit that bell to get notified about more videos coming out. Also, check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines, where you can help support this channel, and by doing so, for even the $1 a month entry, you can participate in these rankings every single month. But check that out. Hope you appreciate it. Thank you for watching these videos, and we'll see you again for another good one. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.